Hello, so we're going to have a look at the question, evaluate the role of the financial sector in developing and emerging economies in promoting economic development. So the key part of this question is the focus on promoting economic development. So we must make sure that our answer throughout refers back to how the financial sector impacts upon economic development. So what we need to do is with our essays is we need to start off with some key definitions. So key definitions that we may wish to include in this essay are obviously what are developing and emerging economies, giving some examples. So for example, emerging economies, you want to be focusing on countries such as India and China, for example. Developing, you may wish to focus on some sub-Saharan African countries, for example. Also, you want to maybe look at what we mean by economic development, and obviously consider how we measure economic development. So maybe briefly outlining the Human Development Index would be a good starter there. And we may also want to explain what the financial sector is. So those would be key definitions to start our response off with. Okay, to ensure that we get the best mark in this question, we need to bring in as much relevant theory as possible and use key terminology to demonstrate a really strong economic understanding. So bringing in theory such as the Haradomar model, for example, is really going to aid our response and show a greater economic understanding. Okay, so the Haradomar model, basically the model was suggested that people needed to save in order to invest. And what the financial sector would do in developing emerging economies is that would allow people to save and therefore invest. So when we talk about saving, we're saving in banks, and then those banks can then give you interest on your savings, and then you can use that money that you've invested, into the bank to then be spent at a later date. Okay, and what you may wish to do here is you may wish to bring in the idea of the loanable funds theory. So we can draw a diagram to represent that. So the loanable funds theory, we'll just draw the relevant curve. We've got the interest rate. I'm just going to abbreviate that to IR. We've got the quantity of money here, or quantity of loans. We've got the upward sloping curve, which is savings. And we've got a downward sloping curve, which is investment. And we'll draw our equilibrium on I star Q. And then with people saving now, because of a well-established financial sector. So the key thing here is we need well-established financial sector to save. Okay, so the importance of the financial sector is it needs to be well established in order to allow people to save. And as the Haradomar model says, people should save in order to invest, and then therefore that should lead to economic development. So as we see here, we've drawn and we've linked in the loanable funds theory here, which was studied earlier on in the course. So what the loanable funds theory says, if there's an increase in the amount of savings, as we demonstrate here with the outward shift of the savings curve from S to S1, what would happen is we would see a fall in the interest rate from I star to I1. So increased savings, and we go from S to S1. There's an extension along the investment curve. And with that extension, we see a decrease in the interest rate from I star to I1. And we see an increase in quantity Q. To Q1. And we're looking there at the number of loans that are taking place, with the quantity of loans increasing. So with that, with people saving more because of well-established financial sector, linking in Harrod-Domar and the loanable funds theory, increased savings should lead to a decrease in the interest rate, as demonstrated by the diagram. And as a result, that would cause a decrease on the cost of borrowing, that lower interest rate. So what that would incentivize people to do is then there'd be increased investment in the future because of the lower cost of borrowing. And that lower cost of borrowing has been achieved because people are saving more because there's a well-established financial sector that has been established. So increased investment, and therefore increased investment would increase aggregate demand. It could also increase the long-run aggregate supply. Okay, we could draw a relevant diagram to represent that point there, but the key thing is now we need to make sure we make reference to how that increased investment, increasing AD and increasing the long-run aggregate supply, how would that lead to economic development? Okay, well, if there was an increase in aggregate demand, that would lead to an increase in real GDP, and therefore there would be economic growth. And as we know, when economic growth occurs, there's a derived demand for labour. And as a result, unemployment would fall. With falling unemployment, there would be an increase in GNI per capita. And GNI per capita, the gross national income per person, per capita, is taken into account in the HDI measure. So what we would see is a rise in the Human Development Index and therefore achieving economic development. So that's a really good point to make. We've linked in numerous theory here. We've talked about the Harrod-Domar model, which talks about the importance of saving to invest. We've brought in the loanable funds theory, again, showing the benefits of increased savings and how that can impact upon the economy with regards to interest rates. And therefore, we can increase real GDP and achieve economic growth, and how that can therefore lead to an improvement in economic development with regards to an increase in GNI per capita. So our point really here has been strengthened by the use of theory, and that's really key to making sure our answers are as good as they possibly can be by bringing in relevant economic theory. Okay, we wish to counter this point now and evaluate the extent to which we would see the increase in the HDI. What we really need to consider is access to the financial sector. So obviously we've talked about people having access to a bank, and therefore having a bank allows them to save, and then can at a later date they can use their savings to invest, and obviously that can lead to the benefits. But we need to consider how much access is there to the financial sector in developing and emerging economies. Maybe in the major cities, for example, there will be access to banks and formal financial institutions which people in that city can use. However, in developing countries specifically, lots of large amounts of the population live in remote areas of a country, and therefore access to the financial sector is very limited, and therefore they have the inability to save their money in a in a financial institution, and actually quite a lot of the population are maybe subsistence farmers. They just produce enough for them to survive, and that's all they do. So access to financial sector, remote areas, no access, and if there's no access, there's no savings, and therefore if there's no savings, there can't be any investment at a later date, and therefore economic development isn't going to be achieved. We may also wish to consider it depends upon the interest rate. How low actually is the interest rate? Interest rates in developing emerging economies tend still to be quite high. So depends how high. So if it's going to be a large cost of borrowing, then it is going to deter investment in the future. So how high is the depends on how high. Okay, so that's a point we could have mentioned and we could have developed in detail with regards to the Harrod-Domar model. Right, what we also may want to consider, again, bringing in relevant economic theory and showing a greater understanding of economics, is we can bring in Forex. Okay, so when we talk about Forex, we're talking about the foreign exchange market. Okay, so having foreign exchange markets allows trade to take place. So the financial sector, with regards to foreign exchange, allows currencies to be exchanged, and therefore that facilitates trade. So Forex allows trade, so the financial sector allows trade to take place. So what does that mean? Well, if trade can take place, there can be an increase in exports, for example. Okay, and when we can talk about exports, we want to use the key terminology that we associated with an increase in exports. We don't just say increase in exports, we want to say an increase in the volume and value. Use that key terminology: increase exports, volume and value. So foreign exchange markets allow trade to take place, and therefore the volume and value of exports should increase. This would therefore increase aggregate demand. I'm going to draw a diagram here because we obviously drew a diagram there, so I don't want to draw too many diagrams, but it would have been nice to have drawn a diagram to represent the increase in AD. But I'm going to draw one here to demonstrate the point that I wanted to make to support it. So we've got our long run aggregate supply curve. AD1, outward shift, our GDP, price level, Y1. Actually, we may see a minuscule increase in the price level from P to P1. So the foreign exchange market encourages trade, therefore exports can rise and rise in the volume and value. That rise in value would lead to an increase in aggregate demand for a developing or emerging economy. Therefore, we see the increase in AD to AD1. What do we see? Well, we see an extension along the long run aggregate supply curve. Therefore, we see an increase in our GDP. Y to Y1, we see a less than proportional increase in the price level, P to P1. And as a result, we will see large amounts of economic growth and reduced unemployment. And as mentioned previously, that reduced unemployment will lead to an increase in GNI per capita, and that increase in GNI per capita is a component of the Human Development Index, and therefore economic development has been achieved. Okay, so as you've seen so far, we've been continuously linking back to economic development, which is key to making sure our analysis is as good as it can be, because we're making sure we've answered the question specifically. So just to recap, the financial sector allows trade to take place, and therefore that can allow exports to rise, and we've linked it to economic development at the end. However, we must be careful here. Again, making sure we evaluate throughout. So our evaluation here, an increased demand for a currency. Well, what's that going to do? Well, it's going to lead to an appreciation of that currency. And what's that going to therefore mean? Well, that would mean that we would have the acronym SPICED. So what we would see with the demand for a currency, if trade is taking place and there's some particular export that people want, then the demand for the currency would therefore rise. It leads to an appreciation of that particular currency. And as a result, exports would become relatively dearer. And if exports become relatively dearer, we're therefore going to see a reduction in the volume and value of X, and therefore there'd be a reduction in AD. And the benefits we've just outlined previously, therefore, may not be seen to the same extent. So we do need to be careful that obviously the financial sector can be brilliant here with regards to offering a foreign exchange market, which can encourage trade and development, trade, which can therefore lead to economic development. However, that trade may not necessarily have a long-term benefit. Actually, we're going to see maybe an appreciation of the currency, and therefore the benefits that we may have originally seen may therefore not be so long lasting. Okay, and again, what we've done here is by talking about appreciation, we're using real economic terminology that shows a really strong economic understanding. So what else may we want to consider in this response? Well, we may wish to consider allowing borrowing to take place. So borrowing, and this can be borrowing either for the private sector or the public sector. So borrowing by public and private sector. In this part, I'm just going to specifically focus on the public sector. So governments, for example, governments could borrow. They could borrow by government bonds. So government borrow by the use of government bonds, for example. So other countries may buy these bonds off governments and therefore provide them with the necessary funds that they can use to therefore spend. Okay, so government bonds, they allows the government to have access to some money. What can that government do with that money? Well, that government can therefore invest. So increased investment. So where particularly may we see investment by the government? So, well, the government, they may want to invest in education. They may want to invest in healthcare, for example. Investment in education, healthcare. Well, let's focus in particular on the investment in education. An investment in education is going to improve human capital within the economy. That improvement in human capital lead to an increase in the quality of labour. As a result of that improved quality of labour, we're going to see an increase in the long-run aggregate supply curve, and we can demonstrate that with a relevant diagram. So, if we draw the diagram relevant here, we've got price level, real GDP, we've got long-run aggregate supply, LRAS1, we've got the outward shift, draw aggregate demand curve in, Y1, outward increase in real GDP from Y to Y1, P1. So here goes. So what we see here is borrowing by the government, so the public sector in this case, increase their investment, education and healthcare. If they specifically invest in education, that would improve human capital. We'd see an improvement in the quality of labour, and that would cause an increase in the long-run aggregate supply curve. And that would be from LRAS to LRAS1. and we'd see an extension along the aggregate demand curve. And as a result, we'd see an increase in real GDP, Y to Y1, and we'd see a reduction in price level, P to P1. Okay, so as previously talked about, when we've got an increase in real GDP, we'd see economic growth, we'd see a reduction in unemployment. That again would lead to an increase in GNI per capita, which again we can link to improvements, therefore, in the HDI indicator. And we'd also see a reduction in cost push inflation. But the key thing I want to focus on here is a different element of the Human Development Index. In particular, obviously, what we want to consider here is we can consider that actually the increase in real GDP from Y to Y1 with reduced unemployment, for example, we therefore would see a reduction in absolute poverty, for example. And again, reducing poverty would be a demonstrative of economic development. So we may wish to include that idea of reduced unemployment is going to reduce absolute poverty, and therefore that represents economic development. But the other thing I want to focus on is the idea if we spend on education and healthcare, there are going to be economic impacts that leads to economic development. So increased spending on education should therefore increase mean years of schooling, for example. So obviously if a government spends an awful lot of money in building new schools, let's say, then we'd expect that therefore young people within an economy would therefore be maintained in education for a longer period of time, whereas previously if they only had a limited amount of schools, then education may only have lasted a fewer number of years. But with more schools now available and necessary infrastructure in place for a proper programme of education, that should increase the mean years of schooling. So that's education looked at there. With regards to healthcare, a more well-equipped healthcare system with necessary doctors and facilities would ensure a increase in life expectancy, because obviously people have access now to state-of-the-art equipment. As a result, these measures will allow an increase in the Human Development Index, because life expectancy and mean years of schooling are also measures in the Human Development Index, and as a result, economic development would be achieved. So we can quite clearly see here we've taken a different approach. We've still focused on economic development, but we've made sure by focusing on reduction in absolute poverty and improving mean years of schooling and life expectancy. But that was the key thing here. We focused on economic development, but lots of slightly different indicators of economic development. So it's good to have a variety of different measures. And what we've seen so far is we've used lots of different theory, which has really shown a greatest understanding of economics. So let's just have a look at evaluating this point that we've just made about borrowing. So obviously the real concern here with borrowing is that there's obviously going to be an increase in government debt, an increase in private debt. So increased debt, for example, okay, so increased amount of debt. So in the short term, so in the short run or short term, you may see increased borrowing and increased investment. However, in the long term, as a result of all the borrowing, there may be increased debt, and therefore in the future they'd see reduction in investment, and actually therefore economic development therefore may not be maintained. Yes, previously we may have got a number of schools built, for example. However, if the debt becomes so substantial that therefore the focus is paying off the debt, these schools, therefore, and education and healthcare may deteriorate. And as a result of the deterioration in education because of the lack of funding, that would lead to a reduction in economic development, a decreased investment, and therefore economic development therefore may actually fall. With regards to government borrowing, you could have mentioned, again, bringing in really strong economics here. We could have talked about the crowding out effect. So obviously, just to recap, the crowding out effect. So the increased demand for credit. So if a government is borrowing lots of money, there's an increased demand for credit. That increased demand for credit is going to push up the interest rates on bonds, for example, and therefore that's going to increase the cost of borrowing, and therefore that's going to reduce investment by the private sector. And that decrease in investment by the private sector is going to therefore negatively impact upon aggregate demand. Economic growth is going to fall, unemployment is going to rise, GNI per capita is going to fall, and therefore economic development will decrease as well. So another really good bit of economics to include, crowding out effect. Really good to talk about. You may also wish to talk about, obviously, financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, how they lend to countries and how countries can borrow from them. But obviously there are restrictions imposed. So obviously if you wish to borrow from the IMF, they tend to impose restrictions such as you must therefore follow strict fiscal or monetary policy, which may have a negative impact upon economic development. So we've seen here in what we've done so far that we've shown how a financial sector can be really beneficial to an economy in promoting economic development, specifically developing in emerging economies. We can talk about how financial sector can allow, in this case, banks from the very first point can allow people to save, and that saving can allow them to invest in the future. We've looked at the foreign exchange market and how that the exchange of currencies can allow trade, and how that trade can lead to economic development. And we've looked again at how governments can borrow money from banks or financial institutions, and how that borrowing can also lead to economic development, whilst critiquing throughout. We may wish to consider that actually there are alternatives which may actually be better than the financial sector. So we may wish to argue that actually, yes, there are the financial sector is important in developing and emerging economies, in promoting economic development, as we've mentioned, but we may actually wish to think about other things that may be more important. So, for example, we may wish to consider that foreign direct investment may be more important. And we need to argue why the foreign direct investment may be more important. So, what that leads to large investment by multinational corporations, for example, and that large investment is obviously going to increase the long-run aggregate supply curve, with obviously new capital being brought into the country. They may be training workers as well, again improving the quality of labour within a particular country. So increase quantity and quality of capital. They may train workers, increasing skill of labour, the quality of labour, and that would obviously lead to increases in the long-run aggregate supply curve. What this would do is, well, we could argue that the reason why this is more important is this improved capital and improved workers can therefore have a long-term impact. Ensuring economic development. So obviously when a country, for example, may borrow, we talked about how borrowing would cause debt. With foreign direct investment, there wouldn't be any debt. A multinational corporation would invest in a particular country. Yes, they may leave eventually, but however, that investment originally has given improvements in the quality of capital and improved the quality of labour. And those improvements in the quality of capital and labour are going to have far-reaching impacts. Whereas the debt, there's going to have to be repercussions with regards to economic decisions taken in order to correct that debt. Whereas the foreign direct investment has immediate benefits, but it also has long-lasting benefits. Yes, the multinational corporation may leave, and it may initially cause some unemployment. However, in the long-term benefit far outweighs that due to the increased quality and quantity of capital and also the training of workers. So we may wish to argue that actually, yes, the financial sector does play an important role, but foreign direct investment, for example, may play an even more important role than the role of the financial sector. Again, more relevant economic theory that we've included in our answer. And then finally, we just need to make sure we have a judgment. So we obviously need to consider the role. So is it important or not? Why? I would probably argue that the financial sector does play an important role in the economic development of developing and emerging economies. Why? Well, it can reduce unemployment, as mentioned previously, and those reductions in unemployment can improve GNI per capita. As well, previously mentioned, we talked about obviously borrowing can therefore allow countries to develop their education and health services, and as a result that can obviously improve mean years of schooling and increase life expectancy, all therefore leading to economic development. So I've given some justification of why I believe the financial sector is important, and what most importantly I did is I specifically linked it back to economic development. And then we need to consider any depends on factors. So what we need to consider is how important is the financial sector? Well, things that depends on factors that we may wish to consider are, well, it depends on the availability of credit, for example. So how does everyone have access to the financial sector? Can everyone benefit from the financial sector? As previously mentioned, some people in countries aren't going to have access to it, and therefore the benefit of the financial sector therefore isn't going to be as strong. We talked about exports being influential. Well, hang on a minute. If the country doesn't have any particular products that are demanded around the world, well then, they're not going to benefit. We may wish to consider when we talk about borrowing. Does a country have significant amounts of tax revenue in order to pay off the borrowing? So it depends on tax revenue to repay borrowing. So obviously in developing countries specifically, there may be large amounts of unemployment, and therefore large amounts of unemployment mean lots of government spending is going towards helping those people to find employment, and obviously the government is receiving very little income tax revenue, and as a result, if the government wanted to borrow money from the financial sector in order to achieve economic development, that is going to be very difficult without incurring large amounts of debt, which may therefore be unsustainable because they are actually receiving very little tax revenue, and therefore they may find it very difficult to borrow and repay that debt. So there are important things that we need to consider specifically with regards to developing emerging economies and the importance of the financial sector and whether it can achieve economic development. So there we have it. The key things that we looked at in this essay were making sure that we focused on answering the question of economic development, and we did that throughout by referring back to particularly the Human Development Index, which is a great measure of economic development. And what we also did is we made sure we included lots of nice economic theory to really substantiate our answers and show that this is real hardcore economics, and shows that you have a solid understanding of all the key theory.